Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. I'd just like to apologise for a drop-off in frequency of posting over the last few weeks. That's because I'm writing a new book. I'm on the first draft. It's about 61,000 words. I've almost finished the first draft. And when I write, I don't have much spare time for reading, so that's why the frequency has dropped off. I will have a Friday reads this coming Friday. For at least 3 books, maybe more. So at the moment, I guess my Friday reads, which is my main video that I post, is fortnightly rather than weekly. So I hope you'll forgive me for that. This is going to be a tag video. I don't do many tags these days, but I did want to do this one because it was a debut tag originated by Fraser Simons over at Springboard Thought, and I really want to support his channel. Fraser and I have become acquainted through BookTube. We've had long conversations in the comments, but also I've picked up recommendations from him, including Charlene Ellsby, a Canadian author who I think is going to be right up my street, and I think I'm going to read all of her oeuvre. So yes, as I say, I'd like to encourage lots of people to go and subscribe to Fraser's channel. I will leave the link to this video that he originated, to the tag that he originated, and obviously you can subscribe to him from there. Okay, so this is called the Book Palate Tag, obviously all about the stupidity of your reading tastes. Sweet. What is a book that made you excited to read more by that author? Bonus point if also somehow exemplifies the genre you most like to read. Well, I'm going to ignore the genre bonus part at this point. So I don't quite understand this question because if I read a book by a new author to me and I don't like it, I'm not going to read that author again, chances are, and that does happen occasionally. If I read a book by an author that is interesting, even if it's, you know, so-so as a read, I'm going to be interested to read other stuff by them. Now, having said that, there are several authors that I'm committed to reading all of their oeuvre. Dennis Johnson, Clarice Lispector, Don DeLillo. I've read all of his stuff. Obviously, he's still alive and he published a new book last year, which I've read. But if he still publishes further books, I'll be reading those. William Burroughs. So there are several authors that I do you know, commit to reading all of their work. As a variation on that, I read my first novel by Leonardo Yasha, an Italian writer from the 1970s. It was called The Council of Egypt, and very good it was too. And I've done something that I almost never do, which is read 2 books by the same author in the same year, but I haven't stopped at 2. I've actually read 7 of his fiction works and 1 non-fiction work, and I have 1 more to go, and this is called Open Doors, and 3 novellas, and one of the novellas included in this collection I've actually read in another book of his that was also a collection of novellas, but I so like this guy that I was prepared to pay full price for a book that I'll only effectively be reading 3/4 of it. So yeah, and on the other hand, this is Tease by Percival Everett, which came out this year. Now, I'd read 3 Percival Everett books a couple of decades ago. Very good they were too, but very postmodern. And I'd sort of thought, yeah, I get his shtick, I don't need to read any more of his. And then a couple of years ago, I had a train journey up to the north of England to go visit one of my sons at university. I picked up in a bookshop, I think in the station or near the station, a Percival Everett book, simply because, oh yeah, I remember this guy. And it wasn't great, and interestingly, he seemed to have ditched the whole postmodernist stuff. And then this year, I saw someone talking about a Percival Everett postmodern book called Percival Everett by Virgil Russell, and it sounded intriguing. I bought it, read it, liked it. And on the back of that, I bought what I thought was his latest book, which is called Telephone, which I haven't actually read yet. But a couple of weeks ago, I saw a booktuber talk about this book, which is published this year, so I think Telephone was probably published originally last year, but only published in the UK this year. Otherwise, he has published 2 books in a year. Now, he is sort of quite prolific. There are 30 books that he's published. Anyway, so I was so enamoured with the sound of this book, described by the booktuber, whose name I can't remember. Apologies. I'll put it in the show notes, the link to his review of this. I went out and bought it. Now, I've almost finished it, and it's terrific. And so this is a case of I read 3 books by the guy, sort of thought I'd had my fill, then by accident, 20 years later or whatever, picked up another book, one of his books, which didn't particularly motivate me to want to continue on with him. But then 2 more books I've read this year by him. So I've kind of rediscovered my love of this author. As I say, he's written 30 books in all. Am I going to commit to reading the lot? I don't know. And equally, I don't know if they're all fiction. Some of them might be non-fiction. So that's about the best way I can do that question. Sour. What book did you initially dislike, but after a reread you reversed your opinion on? Or what is a book you loved at one time, but after rereading it have found it lacking in some way? Bonus point if the book is a genre you similarly reversed your position on. Okay, well, the first thing to say is I don't reread books. I restrict myself to 2 a year, and there's no way I'm going to use one of those valuable slots on a book I didn't like first time round just to see if there's any chance that, you know, I'm going to like it this time around. Doesn't happen. So I'm going to talk about a couple of books, one book that I haven't reread. In fact, I only read it about 2-3 months ago. But I think it makes an interesting case study. So this is Bewilderment by Richard Powers, which was on the book along list. When I was reading it, I loved it. I loved the emotions. I loved the way the author played around with my emotions. I loved its eco message. I just, you know, in the moment of reading this book, it was a fabulous ride. And 2 months later, I'm beginning to think, yeah, I'm not so sure about this book. I feel that some of the conceits that were involved in it weren't, you know, they didn't stack up for me. And as for the eco message, while it's a message I can get behind 100%, and in fact, let me go on a small diversion. When Trump came to power, I was so sort of outraged that I sort of drafted 7 cartoons, 1-frame cartoons, on the likely damage that Trump would do to the American Constitution. And I can't draw stickmen, so I reached out and hooked up with a cartoonist who drew them up, and had this great series of 7 Trump cartoons. So on the back of COP26, and what a shit show that's turned out to be, hardly surprising though, I have drafted another 6 cartoons on the theme of environmental disaster, and happy to say that my cartoonist contact is free and available, and is drawing them up as we speak. So anyway, so the point being that, you know, I have fairly strong feelings on sort of the whole ecological issue. They're not very far removed from what I detect Powers is to be, so we're in the same camp. But the point is, thinking about it, I didn't feel Powers' book educated me or gave me any strong new insights. So that's worn off in the same way as the sort of the conceits I feel didn't hold up. I think if I were ever to reread this, which I'm not planning on it, but if I did, if I got back in the moment of the book and got into the way that the emotions were dealt with by Powers, and how he sort of caressed and manoeuvred me through that, I would probably be sort of, you know, up on this book, high on this book. But I still wonder that, you know, when I finished it and was out of that reading journey, whether it would sink down again, a bit like sort of a sugar rush, really. So that's a sort of, not a reread example, but an example of a book where my opinion seems to be changing. And on to the bonus part of this. If the book is in a genre you similarly reversed your position on. Okay, so let's, you know, I put it off from the first question. Let's talk about genre. Long-time followers of my channel know that I reject the notion of genre in literature. I understand why we have it, but I still think it diminishes the reader, the author and the book. Now, we have the notion of genre because some marketing and salespeople in publishing houses needed a hook to sell their book. They needed to let booksellers and bookshops in the pre-internet days know where to file, you know, which shelves to file these books on. And obviously in the internet online shopping days for algorithms to pick up keywords and genre tags and things like that. So I understand why it exists, but I think, as I say, I think it's to the detriment of literature. The fact that you are asking non-human agency in the form of algorithm to choose books for you, to sort of refine the search, I find distressing. I find it limiting. So, for example, if you just typed in science fiction, you'd get probably the top 100 best-selling science fiction titles. So not really terribly helpful. So you'd have to refine that, and that's where you get things like subgenre, like new weird, or steampunk, or space opera, or hard science, or fantasy, you know, sci-fi fantasy. All of these things. And the problem is that they start to sort of put borders and boundaries between books. And that encourages tribalism. It also encourages, I think, that genre books are written with pre-expectation in its audience. If you buy a steampunk book, you don't want there to be nuclear power in it. And I think that's quite restrictive. Now, obviously, the writers buy into that by making their choices to write within the genre, but I feel that there are certain rules and expectations which can be tilted at, pinched, nipped and tucked in a sort of satirical way. But on the whole, you have to abide by the rules or you will be rejected, but, you know, kicked out of the genre camp. So that's another reason that I don't like it. I will admit readily, from a personal point of view, if you had no genres and you only had fiction and non-fiction, that the fiction section, which is where my interest lies, would get totally unworkable. So that, you know, you'd have Clive Cussler on the shelf for C, with John Grisham on the shelf. Well, you do anyway have Grisham books, but you know, Mills and Boons and Harlequin books in amongst serious, you know, literary fiction, which is a label I also reject, but for shorthand convenience I'll use it here. So that your shelves would just get totally unwieldy because all it would be by alphabetical order of author. So I get it, you know, I would like to be in a bookshop which made no distinctions and all fiction was filed together. It would make my life harder. But in a way I'd rather that than a hard and fastening of genre divisions and genre labels. And just to try and give an example of what I mean by all of this. So take a book like House of Leaves, which I, as a non-genre reader, would put in my all-time top 20 or top 50 books, much to Steve Donohue's annoyance, but in a way that's more plus points to this book, that Steve Donohue does find it annoying. It's a supreme work of literary fiction and of formalistic and stylistic daring. So it's basically a book within a book, or a narrative within a narrative, and you're never quite sure of whose story is being narrated by who. Each time you think you've got a handle on who the narrator is, it turns out that they're sort of a proxy for somebody else. And ultimately, it's a book about a strange house that's a bit like Doctor Who's TARDIS, that is bigger on the inside than it is on the outside, because there are all these sort of dimensions that seem to sort of keep growing. And the owner of the house goes to explore to find out what it's all about. Now, on the one level, that's the plot, but that's not what the book's about. The book is ultimately about a marriage that's in trouble because the owner of this house and his wife, it becomes a metaphor for the distance between them. And it's not only that, it is how it is done, as I mentioned, sort of stylistically. So you get lots of interesting layouts on the page. where the way the words and the text is laid out is almost architectural, which, of course, because in one way it's a book about architecture, so that fits perfectly. So to my mind, it ticks so many boxes of being a really top literary fiction sort of read. When I finished reading it, I went on to Goodreads to see what other people made of it, because no one in my circle had read it. And sort of comment after comment after comment, or review after review after review, talked about it in terms of being a horror supernatural genre book, which really surprised me, because that never entered my head while I was reading it. Having read it, I could see, yeah, of course, those elements are in it, but I never for one moment considered it was a work of genre, in a way that I was gleaning from reading the reviews, that the genre fans of the book never sort of alluded to this being a work of high literary fiction. And I think that's a testament to the book. It's both. It straddles them seamlessly. It can draw readers and fans from very, very different perspectives and pet likes and things like that. That only speaks to the diversity and the strength of this book. Whereas if we abided by genre, we would have this narrow division of it's only a horror supernatural book, or it's only a high sort of stylistic literary fiction book. And it's not, it's both. And that's why I don't like genre. Can I just encourage people that there is a read-along of this book happening, not read-along, or a read-along stroke group read of this book happening, I think, in December, organised by Zena at Beating Around the Books. I shall post her announcement video of this. I'm not taking part in it because I've read it and I don't reread, although this could be one book one day that I might reread, but I don't have time to do it this December and January. So I would encourage anyone who've heard of this book but don't really know what it's about or feel intimidated by it, go and join the buddy read, because there'll be lots and lots of people that you can bounce ideas off and share your thoughts with and stuff. So as I say, I'll post the link to that announcement video. Okay, so that's my tuppence on genre. Okay, Bitter. What is a book that you feel is underrated, attacked unjustly by popular or mainstream opinion, or simply misunderstood in some way? Bonus point, if it is not a book anyone else has mentioned already that you know of. Well, first of all, if no one else has mentioned it, it can't be being attacked. I just thought I'd throw that in there. And I'm not going to choose, it's not about the book so much, it's about the author. And that is Michel Houellebecq, well-known French misanthrope. And let's face it, France has a proud tradition of misanthropes. You know, Molière wrote a play called The Misanthrope. And there's a lot of accusations you can throw against Houellebecq, which are not difficult to justify. He is misanthropic, he's misogynist, he's probably Islamophobic. But, as I say, to me, he just dislikes everybody. And therefore I don't feel that these particular accusations or the particularity of his attacks should be held against him necessarily. This is a wonderful book and a really good place to start with him, although I know in our sort of corner of BookTube, people just won't even abide the thought of picking him up, and that's why I'd like to sort of, you know, recommend that people give him a chance. This is a book where, after parliamentary elections, an Islamic party, not a fundamentalist one, just an Islamic party, has won at the ballot box to form the new government in France. And the only real sort of parochial legislation they bring in is that any government worker has to convert to Islam. And let's face it, France probably has more government workers per head of population than any other country in the world. And the main character in here is a university academic, therefore he's employed by the government, who is researching the Catholic decadent J.K. Huysmans, whose most famous book was called Arabor, and was cited by Oscar Wilde in Portrait of Dorian Gray. So the book is this academic sort of deciding whether he should, you know, convert to Islam to keep his job or just quit the academic life and not compromise. And he has lots of sort of discussions with people in his life. Some academics, some not. Some are converted, some haven't. And it's hard for me to say the brilliance of this book, because the brilliance of this book comes in the ending, whereby his decision whether he's going to convert or not, in the end, has nothing to do with keeping his job, keeping his money, staying at the university for the love of teaching, the love of ideas. It's none of that. It's much more fundamental and basic. And as I say, I can't really talk about it because, you know, it'd be a spoiler. But this guy is criticised, and the only legitimate criticism I feel applied to him is that sometimes he phones parts of his books in, that they're really sort of sloppily written and stuff, as if he switches off or is just producing filler. And yeah, that's in all his books. That's a fair accusation. But there's so much good stuff, and he really is a sort of a deep thinker and a visionary. You know, his debut published novel, translated novel, Atomized, is a really interesting sort of set of ideas. Again, couched in a fairly horrific social setting that he produces. But anyway, this would be my answer to that. Salty. What is a book that changed how you thought about or related to other people, or that made you realise something about yourself you were not aware of previously? Bonus point if you choose multiple books from whatever milestones in your life that feel important to you. Well, I don't feel a book has ever changed the way I relate to people or made me think about myself, sort of existentially and emotionally and things like that. But what books have done has given me food for thought to reflect on as a writer. So they've affected my writing career, I suppose, and my artistic vision. So take a book like The Age of Wire and String by Ben Marcus. This totally turned my head around on language, how language works, what language is for, and how we view language, which we take for granted, and for a writer to take for granted is perhaps a little unforgivable. This book put all of that in perspective and was wonderful. Take another book, Women Talking by Miriam Tease. Now, this book I normally would never have picked up in a million years, because it's about a Mennonite community who are a bit like the Amish, a sort of, anachronistic 17th century religious way of life in the 20th and 21st century. The dual themes of religion and anachronistic religion at that, or historical lifestyles, is just stuff I'm not interested in. But it totally blew me away and won me over. It's the story of a Mennonite community where the women have been drugged and raped and sexually abused in their stupor by some of the men in the community. The men have been carted off to the county jail while the police and authorities sort of investigate this further, which gives these women a window to try and decide what their action should be. Do they stay and meekly await the return of their men? Do they leave the community? Do they stay but confront their men? What is their course of action going to be? And these women are all basically illiterate, because in the Mennonite community, as at least presented here, women are not given education. All they know is the Bible, because obviously they hear it week in, week out from their church, and it's sort of used to sort of structure their daily lives and things like that. So they're basically having a biblical debate, which again, so on the face of it, would make me run a mile rather than read it. But what I found absolutely fascinating was that some of the women were putting their arguments across as literal interpretations of the Bible, and other women were being much more metaphorical, that these were parables, not direct one-to-one correlations. And we all do that. Outside of the Bible and religion, we do that in every aspect of our life. Some of us are more literal and some of us are more metaphorical. And I shall be forever grateful to this book for actually presenting that to me in a way that I'd never imagined or thought about before, because I'm not a Bible person. As I say, it's not just in the Bible though. So, totally surprised, reading out of my comfort zone, even though this is literary fiction. It's not genre, but yeah, that was terrific. Okay, and then Fraser offers us 4 optional prompts, which, quote, he says, are for the connoisseur. Treat the following prompts as if they were different foods. Palates vary depending on what you're consuming, i.e. choose as many or as few as you like. And there are 4 in all. I'm going to choose 2. Okay, this is the sophisticated palette. Choose a book from your favourite subgenre. Again, you'll have to allow me certain leeway with that. Or that has your favourite topic or motif. Or just go off regarding a bookish, nerdy thing you like, enjoy. I want to go back to my point about refining your search online and trying to hit the right algorithm. So, I don't read much science fiction, and I've only read one sci-fi title in the last 2 years. But, you know, occasionally I like to read it. And as I say, if I just put in sci-fi into a Google, into an Amazon search, I'd probably just get the 100 top selling sci-fi titles. But actually, there's a refinement I could make, and I haven't tried this, so I don't know if I put this into Amazon whether it'd actually work and come up with any, you know, list of books for me that I should try. But my favourite type of science fiction are ones that involve language, by which I don't mean just the language they're written. They are actually in some ways exploring language. So, for example, Ian Watson's The Embedding is a wonderful book about language. And the way these books tend to come at it is, if you're dealing with alien races, one can't assume they'd have similar syntax and grammar and vocabulary to us. And in a way, The Age of Wire and String, although I don't think this is science fiction, but you could regard it as science fiction, because one of the possible interpretations of this very strange text is that it is the report of an alien species who have observed us humans, but don't, although they have the vocabulary, because they have access to our dictionaries and lexicons, they don't know how it works on an organic level. So they get this very strangely worded report. All the words are technically correct, but the combinations of them are not, and make for some very odd poetry. So that's not science fiction, but it is about language. So there's that. There's China Miéville, Embassy Town, which is a wonderful, you know, I have my problems with China Miéville, but this is the book of his, I feel, that he brings all his undoubted talents together and doesn't diffuse them by putting in too much, throwing it against the wall and seeing what sticks, infantilizing it like some of his books which are basically for children. You know, none of that. This is a wonderful study. It's a very good science fiction plot, but actually there's a lot of interesting stuff about language formation in here as well. And the only science fiction book I have read in the last 2 years is this, XX by Rian Hughes, who I think is ostensibly a graphic designer. And this is a very visual book. Sorry, it's a very unwieldy book because it's 1,000 pages. And you will see, so there's, you know, things like that going on. Things like that, sort of pictograph language or symbolic language. But there's also quite a significant part of this novel, and why I say it's about language, although again it's a very well developed science fiction book or science fiction plot. You have stuff like this. This is the graphic design elements, stuff like that. But these are actually voices in the novel speaking, but they speak through calligraphy, or their language is represented through calligraphy. So this is the visual aspect of language, unlike these, which are more the sort of functional side of language. And language in science fiction is a combination that's like catnip to me. But is it a subgenre? As I say, I haven't put it to the test. I haven't done an Amazon search to see what would come out if I put sci-fi language. But, you know, it's not uniform. So, for example, we have this, which is Unlanguage by Michael Sisko, who is a new weird writer, like China Miéville is, although Miéville has several strings to his bow. He's not only new weird, although when he writes new weird, I hate it. And I read a book by Sisko, which was purely new weird. What was it called? The Narrator, and I hated it because I just don't get on with new weird at all. But like Miéville, he's offering another string to his bow here, that this is a book sort of involving language. Told as a structural guide to impossible grammar, Michael Sisko's Unlanguage is a brilliant, thought-provoking novel that not only pushes the boundaries of literature but of language itself. No, it doesn't. So, as I say, it's not 100% foolproof. The fact that it was language plus sci-fi initially drew me to it like catnip, but actually it made me sick. So it doesn't always work. But again, you know, this thing about subgenre. And finally, unrefined palate. What is a book or a genre that you consider a guilty pleasure, though you shouldn't actually feel guilty about reading anything really, but hopefully you know what I mean. I don't really have a guilty pleasure for the reason that I don't feel guilty about reading books. In a way, the Houellebecq could be sort of viewed as a guilty pleasure because I know the hostility towards him that exists in the literary world, but I don't feel guilty about reading Houellebecq. But I will admit, in my 20s possibly, I did sort of have a guilty reading pleasure. I used to read books by English football hooligans because each professional football team, had its own crew or firm of hooligans, and there was this whole spate in the 80s of publishers giving them these ex-hooligans money to basically write their experiences, and so you would read one per team really. But I devoured quite a rash of them until, you know, I realised that the problem with football hooligans is they're not very literate and they're not very good, and also they tend to be the same things. It's a bit like an army. Well, they very much saw themselves as an army. So actually, the list of manoeuvres and the list of discipline within the gang is the same, or pretty much the same, across every one. So you read the same thing, just for different teams. And that seemed evidently pointless. But I wasn't guilty at the time. As I say, I only gave up on it because it was just bad literature. So, yeah, there you go. So, thanks very much to Fraser. And I will post the various links to videos. I'm very late in the day to this because I really had to think hard because of the challenges posed to me by genre, and this way of shaping it was about the best way I could do it, I'm afraid. So I'm not going to tag anyone because I think most people will have done it. So till next time, thanks very much.